The elders gave her the shed because it was the worst thing they had to give. No lock on the door, a hole in the roof the size of a wagon wheel, 40 years of dust and dead wasps, and a floor that sagged in the middle like the spine of an old man who had carried too much. They handed the plain woman the key to a building that did not deserve a key, and they told her she could sleep there, if she liked, or she could go back to the world she had chosen. Their faces did not move when they said it. She said, "Thank you." That was the part none of them understood. She stood in the yard in her black mourning dress, looked at the rotting shed her own family had offered her as a punishment, and she said, "Thank you," and she meant it. In 3 days, a man in a suit worth more than a season's harvest would stand in that same yard and go white to the lips. Because the deed to more than $1 million of Lancaster County farmland had been hidden inside the walls of that shed for the better part of a decade. And the woman they had shamed with it was the only living soul who knew how to read what it said. They had already forgotten her name by the time the funeral supper ended. Mary Glick had grown up on this land. She could still find the loose stone in the lane with her eyes shut, the one every child learned to skip over on the walk to the mailbox. She knew which floorboard in the front room announced you before you announced yourself. She knew the sound the wind made through the north field in October, a long, dry hush, like the land clearing its throat before winter. She had left all of it the autumn she turned 19, and she had not come back until the letter reached her that said her father was in the ground. Not a letter, really. A neighbor's phone call to a lawyer's office in the city passed through 3 hands before it found her desk. Elmer Glick had been buried 2 days by the time she heard. His own daughter, and she had not been told in time to see the coffin. She understood why. That was the cruelty of it. She understood exactly why. When she stepped down from the hired car at the end of the lane, she had not owned a horse in years, and a car in that lane was its own small confession. Her Aunt Verna had come to the door, seen who it was, and closed it again. Not slammed, closed, gentle and final. The way you close a book you have decided not to finish. Her Uncle Amos had done the speaking. Amos Glick, her father's older brother, a wide man with a beard gone the color of ash and hands that had never in 60 years been idle. He met her in the yard, so she would not have to be met in the house. "You came," he said. "He was my father." Amos looked at her plain dress, the cap she had pinned back on that morning in the car, with fingers that had forgotten the trick of it and remembered halfway through. He looked at her the way you look at a coin you suspect is counterfeit. Not with anger, exactly. With the tired patience of a man confirming a thing he already knew. "You can stay for the burying," he said. "That is right, after that." He stopped. He did not need to finish. After that, the door. She nodded. She had known the terms before she came. What she had not known, what nobody in that yard knew, because she had never told a soul on this land what she did in the world, was that the terms did not frighten her anymore. She had spent the better part of a decade in rooms where men in better suits than Amos would ever see had tried to make her small, and had learned, slowly, at cost, that a room could only shrink you if you agreed to it. She did not agree to it. She said, "Where can I sleep?" And Amos, who was not a cruel man, only a frightened one, gave her the shed. It had been her father's once. That was the thing they had all forgotten, or chosen to forget. Long ago, before Mary was born, before the big barn went up, Elmer Glick had worked wood in that shed. Chairs and cradles and the long plain benches the church still sat on every other Sunday. She had spent 100 hours of her girlhood on the floor of it, watching sawdust turn gold in the afternoon light, listening to her father hum tunelessly through a mouth full of finishing nails. They had given her a punishment and called it a shed. They did not know they had given her the last room on earth that still smelled like him. She found the folding rule the first night. She had cleared a corner to lay out her bedroll, dragging aside a broken chair, a coil of rusted fence wire, a crate of jar lids gone orange with age. And there, wedged behind a warped shelf, was her father's carpenter's rule, the wooden folding kind, brass at the joints. Worn pale, where his thumb had opened it 10,000 times. She knew it in the dark by the feel of it. She sat down on the sagging floor with the rule in her lap and did not cry exactly, but something moved in her chest that had been still for a long time. She unfolded it, folded it, unfolded it again. The joints still worked. Of course they did. He had made things to last, her father. That was the whole of his religion. When you got down under the words that a man's work should outlive him and cause no one trouble. She did not sleep much. The hole in the roof let the cold in and let a wedge of star-crowded sky in with it, and she lay looking up at it, thinking about a girl who had run toward exactly that sky, and a father who had never once written to say he wished she had stayed. She had gone during her running around years. When a young person is let loose to taste the world before choosing against it, most tasted and came home. Mary had tasted a library, a single county library 3 towns over, where a kind woman let her read past closing. She had read law books because they were the thickest, and she was stubborn, and somewhere in those pages she had found a language that did what her father's silence did. It made a promise you could hold and no one could take. She had not come home. She had taken a bus, then a test, then a scholarship, then 8 years, and each of those was a door, and behind the last one her father was a coffin 2 days in the ground. He had never written. But she had learned since, from a neighbor at the funeral supper, in a sentence dropped and never picked back up, that Elmer Glick had driven his buggy past that library every market day for 8 years. Slow. Every single week, and had never once gone in. The trouble came on the 3rd day, and it did not come from the community. It came in a grey sedan with a rental sticker in the window, driving too fast for the lane, and it did not skip the loose stone. 3 men got out. 2 she did not know. The 3rd she recognized the moment he unfolded himself from the passenger seat, though she had never seen his face before in her life, recognized the type of him, the cut of the suit, his eyes doing inventory on the farm before they did courtesy on the people. She had sat across conference tables from 100 of him. His name, she would learn within the hour, was Preston Vance. Acquisitions Counsel, said the card he did not bother to offer her. He offered it to Amos. He offered it to the 2 other men of the church who had come out to the yard. His gaze passed once over Mary, the plain woman in the black dress, hovering near the shed with a bucket in her hand, and he did the thing she had watched men do her whole professional life. He decided, in under a second, that she was furniture. "I'll speak plainly," Vance said, which is what men say before they lie plainly, "because I respect that plain is how you people prefer it." Amos said nothing. Silence was the community's oldest tool, and Amos wielded it like an axe. Vance held up a folder. The 86 acres north of the creek, the Glick tract. He said the name of the land the way a man reads a stranger's name off a package. "There's a title problem, an old one. Your family's had the use of it for a long time, I understand, generations, but use isn't ownership. And the underlying deed, the recorded instrument that would actually establish clear title," he opened his hands, sorrowful, generous. "It doesn't exist. Or if it ever did, it was never properly recorded at the county. Which means, legally, that ground has been sitting open for a very long time. My clients acquired the competing interest, a railroad right-of-way from the last century, quieted through the courts. It's been done. It's clean." He smiled without warmth. "You have 30 days to vacate the tract. I'm here to be a gentleman about it. I could have sent the sheriff." Later, Mary would be able to name every place he had lied and every place he had merely misled. But she would remember, most of all, The sound the yard made when he finished. Nothing. A hush. The same dry hush the Northfield made in October. The whole family understanding all at once that the 86 acres, the acres where the church stood, where the burying ground was, where 3 generations of Glicks lay under plain stone markers with nothing but a name and 2 dates, that all of it might not be theirs. Amos found his voice. That land is ours. It has been ours since... Since when? Vance said gently. Show me the paper, and I'll be on my way. He knew there was no paper. That was the whole of his business, finding families who lived by their word and taking from them by the one thing they had never learned to keep. Paper. Amos had no paper. Nobody had paper. Mary set the bucket down. She did not speak. Not yet. She was watching the 2 silent men behind Vance, the ones who had not been introduced, and she had already understood what they were. One of them was County, by the plastic lanyard he'd forgotten to remove, and the other was carrying a surveyor's case. They had not come to negotiate. They had come to measure what was already theirs. She went back into the shed. She had noticed it the second night, and told herself she was imagining it, the way a child imagines a face in a knothole. The floor of the shed sagged in the middle, yes, but it sagged wrong. A floor rots evenly, or it rots where the water comes in. This floor dipped in one clean rectangle near the workbench, a rectangle the size of a large Bible, and the boards over that rectangle were newer than the boards around them. Not new, but newer. Cut by a careful hand and laid without a single nail head showing, which is a thing only a certain kind of craftsman can do, and only when he means for the work not to be seen. She knelt. She took out the folding rule. She did not know yet what she was measuring for. She only knew her father had built something into this floor and had wanted no one to find it, and that a man who hides a thing in his own hand's work leaves the measurements of it in the only language he trusted. He had taught her that language before she could read the other kind. Measure twice, girl, he used to say. Cut once, and the world will never catch you short. She had thought it was about wood. She had been maybe 7, kneeling right here, and he had folded this same brass rule open and set her small hand on it and made her read the marks aloud until the numbers stopped being numbers and started being a promise a person could keep. Measure twice. She had built a whole career on it and never once made the connection until this exact moment, on this exact floor, with the whole of her family's ground about to be measured out from under them by a stranger. She ran the brass edge along the newer boards, found the seam, found under a lip of wood no thicker than a fingernail, the shallow notch where a blade could go. The panel came up clean, silent, balanced. Even after all this time it lifted as he had built it to lift, and she thought absurdly, through the roar starting up behind her ribs. He oiled the hinge. There was a hinge. Her father, who trusted no lock, had built a hinge into his own floor and oiled it and told no one, and left it for a hand that knew to look. Inside was a tin. A Japan tobacco tin, the kind the old men used for nails, its lid pressed down tight against the damp. And inside the tin, folded in oilcloth, folded again in wax paper, was a document so old the folds had gone soft as cloth. She knew what it was before she read a word of it. Her hands knew. Years of other people's title work, of chains of ownership stretching back before the county had a courthouse, and her hands knew the weight of a genuine 19th century instrument, the way Amos's hands knew a green board from a seasoned one. She read it by the light coming through the hole in the roof. A grant of land. 86 acres north of the creek, the boundaries described in the old way, by the creek and the ridge and a white oak that had probably been firewood for 50 years. Granted in fee simple, the deepest, cleanest form of ownership the law knows, the kind that answers to no railroad and no right-of-way, and no gentleman in a $900 suit, to one Jacob Glick and his heirs forever. her great-great-grandfather. And in the corner, where the county clerk's mark should have been, where Vance was so certain no mark existed, there it was, faded to the color of weak tea. But there, recorded. The old man had recorded it. It had been filed at the county the year it was granted, more than a century past, and then, somewhere in the long quiet decades between, the county's own record of it had been lost. A fire, a flood, a careless clerk. The original had survived because a Glick had done what Glicks did. He had kept his word, and the paper that proved it, safe in his own 2 hands. Her father had found it. Somehow, sometime before he died, Elmer Glick had found the deed his own great-grandfather recorded, and he had understood, in whatever silence he understood things, exactly how much danger it was in and exactly how much it was worth. And he had not taken it to the bishop. He had not taken it to Amos. He had hidden it in the floor of his own shed, under a panel with an oiled hinge, and he had died without telling a living person where it was. Except Mary sat back on her heels in the sawdust light and understood the second thing, the thing that took the breath clean out of her. He had left it for her. Not the bishop, who would have prayed over it and let it be taken, because fighting was the world's way, and the world was not their concern. Not Amos, who could not read a deed if his life sat on it, and whose life did. He had left it in the one room in the world that was only his and hers. He had left it behind a piece of joinery so fine that only someone who had watched him work, who had sat on this floor as a girl and learned that his measurements were his true tongue, would ever think to look. He had built the hiding place for the exact hands that were now holding what it hid. Her whole life she had believed her father died ashamed of her, believed he had watched her go off to the world's schools to learn the world's laws, and had counted it a grief he carried to the grave. He had counted it a hope. He had needed someone who spoke the world's tongue. And when the world came for his family's ground, as some part of him must have known it one day would, the only weapon he had left was a daughter he was not allowed to be proud of out loud. She folded the deed back into its oilcloth. She stood up. Her knees were shaking and her hands were not, and that was exactly the right way around. She walked back out into the yard. Vance was already turning to leave, satisfied as a man is when he has been cruel and called it courtesy. The county man was writing something on a clipboard. The surveyor had a tripod half out of the sedan's trunk. "Mr. Vance." He turned. He looked at her, the plain woman, the bucket carrier, the one he had filed under furniture, with the first flicker of impatience. "Ma'am, this really doesn't concern. You said show you the paper." Something in her voice stopped him. Not volume. She had learned long ago that volume was for people who did not expect to be listened to. The flatness, rather. The professional flatness, the courtroom flatness, the sound of a person who has read the document and is no longer asking a question. Amos was staring at her. They all were. "You said," Mary went on, "that the deed doesn't exist, that it was never recorded. You've built your client's whole quiet title action on the assumption that there is no recorded instrument establishing clear fee simple in the Glick line." She was not raising her voice, and she was not stopping. "You should have pulled the historical index before you drove out here in a rental car to frighten a family out of their own burying ground. That's a first-year mistake, Mr. Vance. I'd have fired an associate for it." Din. The yard had gone very still. Vance recovered fast. She would give him that. His kind always recovered fast, because the recovery was the whole job. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, and the smile came back, thinner. "But a woman in a bonnet throwing courthouse words around doesn't change a filed action. My client has a court order. You have—" His eyes flicked over her, the dress, the cap, the bucket by her foot. An opinion. "I have a name," Mary said. Would you like to hear it before you finish that sentence or after? Vance's mouth opened. I'm sorry, who? Mary Glick. She let the plain name sit there a second, the farm name, the name he had already dismissed. Then she gave him the rest of it, the part the card would have said if she had ever handed him one. I do title and land claims for one of the firms your client can't afford to be sued by. I've quieted more titles than you've filed, and I'm telling you as a courtesy, gentleman to gentleman, the word came back at him with the skin peeled off it, that if that surveyor puts one leg of that tripod on the North Tract, you are going to spend the next 3 years explaining to a judge why you attempted to take recorded, clear title land from its rightful heirs by fraud. She held up the tin. She did not open it. She did not need to. She had learned that too, that the thing itself is never the weapon. The weapon is the other man's sudden, total certainty that you have the thing. It was recorded, she said. Fee simple. Jacob Glick and his heirs forever. The county's copy burned or flooded sometime in the last century, which is the only reason you found a gap to crawl through. But the original was filed. It bears the clerk's recording mark. And the chain of heirs, from Jacob Glick to the people standing in this yard, is not complicated, Mr. Vance. I can draw it for you on the back of your own card. That was when he went white to the lips. She would remember it a long time, the color leaving his face from the mouth outward, the way blood leaves a man who has just understood that the room he walked into as the strongest person in it is a room where he is now the one who has made an unforgivable, expensive, career-ending mistake in front of witnesses, in a yard, on a farm, to a woman he had decided in 1 second was not worth a business card. Nobody in that yard moved. The 2 churchmen who had stood behind Amos with their hats in their hands, men who had watched this same daughter be shown to a rotting shed and had said nothing because saying nothing was how they kept the peace, looked now at Preston Vance as though a wolf had just discovered the fence was live all along. Amos's jaw had come loose. He did not understand a word of quiet title or fee simple. He understood the color of the man's face. He understood that the plain woman his own family had shamed with a broken shed had just, without lifting her voice, taken a stranger in a fine suit and folded him shut like a carpenter's rule. That would have to be authenticated, he managed. You can't just, it will be authenticated, Mary said. By a court, on my motion, with the historical index and a forensic document examiner and every dime of my client's costs assessed against yours. And you will lose. You know you'll lose, because you know exactly how quiet title works, which means you know what a recorded original does to your railroad right-of-way. She almost felt sorry for him. Or you can get in your car. Tell your client the title's clouded, by which you'll mean it's perfectly clear, and clearly not his, and point that rental back at the highway. You won't skip the loose stone this time either, but that's the only thing you'll take off this land. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the county man, who had not signed on for fraud, quietly clicked his pen shut and put the clipboard under his arm. The surveyor pushed the tripod back into the trunk, and Preston Vance, Acquisitions Counsel, looked once around the yard, at the plain men, at the plain woman, at the shed with the hole in its roof, as if he could not, even now, make the pieces fit. Then he got in the car. They did not skip the loose stone. Mary heard the axle knock against it the whole length of the lane, growing smaller until the dust settled back onto the road and the north field went quiet again, the long, dry hush, the land clearing its throat. The community did not thank her. That is not their way. And she had not stayed away for 8 years to come home and forget it. There was no supper in her honor. No one stood in the yard and made a speech about the daughter who had gone into the world and come back to save them. That kind of thanks belongs to the world, and the world was not their concern. But something in the yard had changed, and everyone in it felt the change without naming it. Amos came to the shed that evening. He stood in the doorway a long time, the same doorway he had shown her to as a punishment, and his eyes went to the panel in the floor, still open, and to the tin in her hands. "He never said," Amos told her. His voice had gone rough. "Elmer never once said he had it." "He couldn't," Mary said. "You'd have prayed over it and let them take it." Amos did not argue because it was true, and lying was a worse sin than losing a farm. He looked at his brother's folding rule where it lay on the workbench. "He built the hiding place for your hands," Amos said slowly. He was working it out even as he said it, the way a man works out a joint that does not quite fit until suddenly it does. "Not the bishop's, not mine, yours." "Yes, he knew you would come. He knew somebody would have to." Amos was quiet. Then he said the only thing he had it in him to say, which was more than she had expected, and less than her whole life had been asking for. "He was a stubborn man, my brother. Stubborner than the church. Stubborner than me." A pause. "You are his." It was not "I'm sorry." It was not "stay." It was not "we were wrong to close the door." But it was he named you as his, out loud, in the doorway of the shed. And for Amos Glick, that was a sentence he would carry to his own grave for having said. She let it be enough. She had learned that too, somewhere in the 8 years, that you take the thanks a person is able to give, in the language they are able to give it, or you spend your life starving in front of a full table. She stayed 4 more days. She filed nothing yet. There would be time for that, the motion, the historical index, the authentication, all the machinery of the world she had gone away to learn. She did it later, quietly, from the city, and she paid for it herself, and the community never knew the cost of it, and she never told them. Vance's client withdrew the claim within the month. The 86 acres north of the creek stayed with the people who had buried 3 generations in it, and the burying ground stayed where it was, and no tripod ever touched it. But those 4 days she did not spend on law. She spent them fixing the roof. She climbed up on the sagging shed with a bundle of cedar shakes she bought with her own money from a mill 2 townships over, and she patched the hole the size of a wagon wheel, and it took her longer than it would have taken her father because her hands had forgotten some things and had to be reminded. Amos brought her the ladder. Katie, her younger sister, who had stayed and married and had a baby on her hip and had not spoken to Mary since the funeral, came and held the shakes up to her one at a time without a word, which from Katie was a great deal of words. On the second afternoon, the smell reached her up on the roof. Hay curing in the near field, wood smoke from someone's supper fire, the green cedar under her own hands, and under all of it, the horse and leather smell of a place that had not changed in 100 years and did not intend to. It went into her like a nail, into soft pine. She had spent 8 years telling herself she did not miss it. She had been lying, and she had known she was lying, and up on that roof with a shake in her teeth she stopped bothering to. "He'd have done it faster," Katie said from below. First words in 8 years. "He'd have done everything faster," Mary said. "That was the trouble with him." Katie almost smiled. The baby grabbed a fistful of her mother's apron, and neither sister said anything else, and it was somehow a conversation. On the last morning, Mary folded the deed into its oilcloth one final time and put it in the leather case she used for the world's work, because the world was where it would have to be kept safe now, filed and copied and authenticated and armored against the next man in a rental car. That was hers to carry. That was the part of her the community could not use and would never understand, the part that spoke the world's tongue, that knew how to keep a promise in paper and not only in word. She left the folding rule in the shed. She had thought about taking it. Her hand had closed around it twice, but it belonged in that room, on that bench, in the light that turned to gold in the afternoon, the way it always had. the way her father had left it for whoever might one day sit on that floor and need to remember that measurements were a language, and a language was a kind of love. She set it back exactly where she found it, behind the warped shelf, brass joints and all. The hired car came up the lane. It did not skip the loose stone. The driver was not from here. Katie walked her to the end of the lane with the baby. Amos stood in the yard by the shed with the new roof, one hand on the doorframe, and he lifted the other one. Not a wave. The community does not wave. Only a small flat gesture, palm out, that meant go, and meant come back, and meant a dozen things there were no words for and did not need to be. Mary got in the car. She rode down the lane between the fields she had run away from and had never, it turned out, entirely left. Behind her, the shed stood square against the morning. The punishment they had given her, the last room that smelled like her father, the floor with the oiled hinge and the language folded inside it. Ahead of her was the city and the case on the seat beside her, and the long life she had built in a world her family would go on believing she had lost herself in. She did not know, even then, which of the two worlds was hers. She had a father who had spoken to her only once in the last 8 years of his life, and he had done it in a hidden flaw in the tongue of a carpenter, and it had said everything. She had a farm that was safe because she had gone away, and a family that could love her only in the doorway, sideways, in gestures with no words. She had a leather case that held 100 years of a promise, and behind her, on a workbench, in a shed with a new roof, a wooden rule folded shut, waiting for a hand that knew how to open it. She looked back once. The north field made its long, dry sound, and she could not have told you if you had stopped the car and asked her whether she was leaving home or going to it, which was, she thought, watching the farm grow small in the glass, probably the truest thing her father ever taught her, that a person could belong to two worlds and be at rest in neither, and that this was not a wound to be healed, but a weight to be carried straight-backed, the way he had carried everything, all the way to the ground. The loose stone knocked once against the axle as they reached the road. She did not tell the driver to slow down, but she smiled a little when she heard it. Some things you take with you whether you mean to or not.